Quarto is a great tool to generate all kinds of outputs from the same file using all kinds of programming languages. And since version 1.4, Quarto also makes it very easy to create static dashboards that you can assemble using code snippets from your preferred programming language. So whether you are into R or Python or Observable.js, you can easily generate dashboards through the same kind of system. And today I'm going to demonstrate that to you with this dashboard. It has a couple of pages where it gets progressively more interactive, but at the end of the day, all of this is still considered static, so you don't need anything like a Shiny or Shiny for Python server to make this work. So let me just go through this dashboard quickly so that you know what we're going to build today. On the first page of this dashboard, you just have a static text, the static table, and the static plot. It doesn't matter if you hover or click on any of the plot or the table, nothing will happen. Everything is purely static. On the second page, everything gets a little bit more interactive. You now have a dynamic plot. So when you hover over it, you see a tooltip for the corresponding points which you are currently hovering over, and you see a hover effect where parts of the chart come into focus and others fade away. On the next page, we have an interactive table. This means we can sort things according to the values in the table rows, and that's basically it. On the next page, we then have interactive selection. We do have a sidebar, which we can toggle or untoggle. In the sidebar, we have the option to unselect a couple of species, and as we do that, the amount of things that we see in the table shrinks or grows. And finally, on the last page, we add value boxes to that. So all of this we will build today, but I will go through this from a bird's eye perspective, so we won't go through each part of the code, because this will be quite a lot, and I want to give you the overview of how to use Quarto. Of course, you can always leave comments if you want me to focus on a particular thing in another video. So with that said, let's start with the static version. So in my Quarto file, I already have the most important part that you need to actually create a dashboard, and that is the format, which is set to dashboard, and all of this needs to happen in the YAML file. I also included a title and a theme, but that stuff is purely optional, but it's always good to set these kind of things. And if you render this, you will get a blank dashboard where only a title is shown. And the way to structure a dashboard is now to include a couple of markdown headlines. So if you were to use a level 1 heading, let's call this level 1 heading, and re-render your website, you will see that you get another page. And with the same logic, you could add more pages to this. So you could do level 2, level 3, and level 4. So with that, you could navigate through different pages. Of course, all of them are empty now, so let's put in some content here. Let's first throw in some generic text. If we render that, we see that by default, Quarto will generate cards for you, and these will be expandable, so you can make them full screen, and all of these kind of expand features happen automatically. And now if you go through the pages, you see that truly only the first page has content, because this is where we have some content here. So let's throw in a couple of things just to understand how Quarto operates. Let's throw in a code chunk. Let's put a 1+1 in here. And you see here now that another card was generated, and we see only the output and not the input of the code chunk, which is a specialty of the dashboard format, because usually in a dashboard you don't want to see the generating code. So right now we are throwing everything onto the same level 1 heading area. So let's also throw in level 2 stuff, and let's repeat this thing here to see what's going on. As you can see here now, it's kind of the same thing, so let's actually throw in something else in here. Let's just throw in 3. You see here that these things correspond to what is in the first row, and these things correspond to what is in the second row. So really level 2 headings are kind of rows, so we could even label them rows 1 and rows 2. So basically with these headings you can determine the structure, and Quarto will fill in the things for you, depending on how many outputs you have. Now, as we've seen, Quarto by default throws a card for all of our outputs, so we don't actually have to create something like a container to group things together, but we could if we wanted to, and this can come in handy if you want to modify, say, the width of your card. For example, if you use the Quarto colon notation with these 3 colons, then you can put in everything into a card. So if we throw this in there, then we see that everything that we put between these colons is still placed into the same card, but now we can also use things like the width attribute. And similarly, we could use the other thing from that same row and put in a title instead of changing the width. As we've seen in the beginning of this video, we can throw anything we want into a title like that. And here we just throw in, look, penguins data, and that way we get a nice title for our card. And to bring this dashboard into the structure that we've seen in the beginning of this video, let us actually remove these things here. And instead, let us just throw in a card in there. For now, we can just leave this as generic output. But for the title, I want to throw in the title we've seen in the final dashboard. So with that, we only have to figure out how to fill these cards. So let's check what we had on the first page of our dashboard. I've just rendered this, and as this is rendering, we can see here in the first card there's some text, in the second card there's the table, and in the third card there's the plot. And the easiest way to include text chunks like this is to have a separate markdown file that has only the text inside of it. And for that, I have a markdown file here where you can use the typical markdown notation that you are already used to. And then you can, in your code chunk, in there you can just use include markdown from the HTML tools package and just link to your markdown file in there. And if you render this, then you get something that looks like this. Notice how an extra markdown file made it easy to use the nice syntax from markdown notation to get things like a bold headline or the formatting for code chunks. And you couldn't just use these things inside of your Quarto dashboard because these headings now have a special meaning. So it's best to just have all of that text separately. And this also helps you to have some parts of your dashboard in separate files. It makes everything just a little bit nicer to operate with. Now for the next part, we need to load a couple of packages, and I want to keep my output code chunk as short as possible. So this is why I can just throw in a code chunk at the beginning that loads all of the packages and sets up variables like the colors that I want to use. All of that can be set in the first code chunk. So here, let me just throw in a couple of packages that I want to use, and let me add a couple of colors. And if I execute this, we can look at the color palettes. You can see here that for Adderley, Gentoo, and Chinstrap, these are the species of the penguins in my dataset, in the Parma Penguins dataset. For these, I want to use these colors. And the nice thing about this is that right now, this part here doesn't generate any output. So this is why even if we render this, we don't see any change in the dashboard. But just to be sure that these things are not included in the dashboard, we can also set the context code chunk option and set it to setup. That way, even if we add stuff later on, we can be sure that this code chunk doesn't generate any output. And now let us throw in the easy part, and that is the plot. We can just scroll down to row 2 here and throw in the code chunk that generates the code for us. And in this case, it's just taking the Parma Penguins dataset and then throwing some ggplot code on top of that. And if we render this, we can now see that we do have our plot inside of that card, but the dimensions don't look quite right. And in this kind of setting, we can just change the code chunk options and throw in thick width and thick height to get the aspect ratio right. And that way everything looks a bit nicer, or at least the card is filled a little bit better. For the table, we can do the exact same thing. We just have to fill that code chunk with the code that generates the table. Here, that code is quite long, so I just throw everything in here. I will give you just the gist of it, which is basically I get all of my complete data. I calculate the summaries of the weights of the penguins, which will then give me minimum, mean, maximum of the penguin weight by species. And then I have a bit of code, quite a bit of code, I hope I'm honest. All of that is just to generate a nice GT table that looks like this. And I will put a couple of links in the description of this video that show you how to make these kind of GT tables. But the point is, when you can generate something like this, you can just include this code chunk in your dashboard, and also this stuff will appear there. Next, let us make our chart more interactive. Remember, right now it's just static. If we hover over this, nothing is happening, and we can make this happen by using the ggref package. It's an incredible package that makes it really easy to turn any ggplot into an interactive plot, and I have a deep dive video into that package as well, and I will also put a link to that in the description of this video. Here, all we need to know is that we have to modify the code that generates the plot. And the main changes here are really that we just made the GM point layer into a GM point interactive layer and filled the gref specific aesthetics data ID and tooltip with some data. And then once we have this as a ggplot object, then we have to make sure that we actually render the ggplot object via the gref function. And if we Do that and try to render this. We see that we get an error because I forgot to include the ggref package in here. Since we want to use that now, let's also add it. And now if we execute this, now we see that we do get a ggref plot. But this gref plot is really tiny and there's nothing really we can do about it in the gref code. And instead we have to use some CSS code to tell the container that has the gref output to use the full width. And the easiest way to do that is to just at the top of your file include a code chunk, and since we use Quarto, we can use all kinds of code chunks, and this also includes CSS code chunks, and that way we can just throw in the CSS code that tells the gref classes and gref container classes to use no margin left and right and the full height. And now if we do that, then everything looks much nicer. But unfortunately, the CSS code chunk generates a card here. So let us take the trick from before with the context setup and include this in this code chunk as well. But unfortunately, this didn't really help, and this is kind of unfortunate, which is why I have worked out a way to make sure that all of the setup code chunks truly never show up, and that is with additional CSS information that tells all the containers with the data context set up to have a display of none, which means that they don't appear. And if you render this, then unfortunately this didn't work because I didn't put this code chunk into the right position. This code only works if we do it outside of the first page. So this is why we move everything up a little bit. And now if we re-render this, then everything works much better. It's a bit of a shame that we did have to use this workaround, but once again, it just goes to show that knowing a couple of HTML and CSS tweaks goes a long way to make your outputs look a lot nicer. And maybe in a future iteration of Quarto, this will not even be necessary. For example, you can see here now that our tooltips, our hover tooltips work out quite nicely. But when I was preparing this code, I actually added some extra CSS code to make this work. But now for Quarto, it works out of the box, so we don't even have to fix anything. But just in case you want to try this and you don't have the newest version available for you and the tooltips do not really show up, then the trick is to go into your gref code and within the options, include that the tooltip has a really high Z index, which means it always shows up on top. And that way you can guarantee that the tooltip definitely works. Oh, by the way, this reminds me, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button because that helps me to make better and more videos. And if you really want to make my day, you might want to check out my data visualization course. This course will teach you all of the fundamental data viz principles and then show you how to do all of those things with ggplot. Check out that course if you're interested in that. And now let's get back to the video. Alright, cool. Now let's move on to making our table interactive. For starters, it would be nice if we can sort our tables. And just like with our interactive chart, where we had to resort to a different package to make that work, we have to do the same thing with this table. So that's why instead of using our GT code here, let us use the reactable package to create a table that is sortable. Once again, I won't bother you with the full details for now. Let me just throw in the code and tell you that it requires the reactable package. And the nice thing out of the box, if we render this, then the table that we generate is sortable by default. Oh, and by the way, in case you get worried that you cannot reproduce any of this without the full code is also available to you, and I will put the link to that in the description as well. Alright, for the next part, we want to have a sidebar with a couple of toggles that will include or remove penguin species inside of our reactable table. And the way to do that is to, within our first page, create another row that has the class sidebar. And if you do that, then you immediately get a sidebar, which is nice. So it's pretty easy to make this happen. But unfortunately, this also changed our layout of the main panel. And this has been confusing to me at first. And I asked the kind Quarto people on GitHub what's going on there. And basically the reason why this is happening is because the sidebar always adds in a full new column. And the trick to avoid that is to also include a full column for the main part. So let's throw in a level 2 heading and call it main body. But of course, this requires that all of our other rows have to become a level 3 heading. So we add one there, we add one there, and then everything should be fixed. Nice. So now we can go up to our sidebar and throw in a bit of code that throws the inputs for us. And since the first code chunk in our Quarto file was the CSS code chunk, Quarto thinks that we want to add that too now, but of course we don't want to do that, so let us make this into an R code chunk, and then we can throw in the code, and that generates the input boxes for us. Again, I don't want to go into too many details about what's happening here. Basically, we use the tags input function from the HTML tools package to generate checkboxes here. And we do that for every species in our data set, and this is why we use map to iterate over that. And if we render this, we can see here that div isn't included, and of course all of this requires the HTML tools package. And if we render that, then we can see here that we do have checkboxes there now. And once again, I feel like you probably must be getting tired of me saying this at this point. I do have an extra video on HTML tools and how to use it to create inputs and a user interface. I will put a link to that into the description as well. For now, let's continue with the big picture of our Quarto dashboard here. You see right now, if we remove any of these, then nothing changes. And believe it or not, the way to make this work could fill in an entire video. And in fact, I did create a separate video for this. So let me just refer to that in the description of this video. And let's focus on the value boxes for now, because this is something we can easily include. And then we have our dashboard more or less complete. And for getting the checkboxes working, you can always refer to either the full code or the separate video that makes that happen. And for creating the value boxes, we can create another row, the one that is between the first and the second row. So let's throw in a row, let's call it row value boxes. And then we can throw in an R code chunk in here to generate value boxes for us. And there's a simple way to include value boxes through Quarto by just putting a list into that code chunk. But I feel like it doesn't give you enough options to customize the value boxes. So this is why I like to use the value box function from bslib. And in there I can specify a title and a value that is supposed to be displayed. And this one can be easily computed. And if we render this, then we see that right now we just get a blank value box. So this is why in the theme we can set something like primary. And if we do that, then we see that this value box is now uses the primary color of the flatly theme that we are currently using. And if we want to use a nice penguin icon in our value box, we can set the showcase argument to some image tag. And in there, we just have to set the source to a PNG file of the penguin that we want to use. And if we render this, then we see that we start to see a penguin. And by setting the height, we can actually make the penguin have a height that is reasonable for this value box. Of course, this requires you to have this penguin file available, and I got it from flat icon. Of course, if you want to use an icon from there, you have to attribute to this, and this is what I'm basically doing through this video here. So what I did was I downloaded it for free, and then I included it the way I've just shown you. And if you want to include 3 value boxes and not just one, you can basically repeat the same procedure for the Gen 2 penguins and for the chin strap penguins. And now you get 3 penguin boxes. But of course, it would be nice if the value boxes could have the same colors as in the table and in the chart. So this is why we can use the same colors that we defined earlier, but we set up new theme variables and not R variables with these colors. And then in our value boxes, we cannot link to theme primary. We can link to theme Adderley, theme Gen2, and theme Chinstrap. But again, this requires that these 3 theme variables are available. And the way to do that is to enhance the theme that we're currently using, namely the Flatly theme, and add to this a couple of theme changes via an SCSS file. For example, you could name that file extratheme.scss, and inside of that file, you can set a couple of additional theme colors for Adderley, Chinstrap, and Gen2, just like we did before. And then inside of your value boxes, you can make the theme changes. So in there you use Adderley, you use Gen2, and there you use Chinstrap. And now if you render this, everything looks nice, and we have the same colors for each species. And for the sake of full disclosure, right now, if you do it like this, the sidebar cannot move in and out anymore. And that's a bit dumb, but using value boxes from bslib comes with a couple of JavaScript things that are loaded as well, and this apparently blocks this moving in and out of the sidebar. And a workaround for that is to strip all of these extra things that are supposed to be loaded with bslib, and you can easily do that by passing your value boxes to format and then to HTML. And now if you render this, your sidebar can move back in and out. This is something that will likely change in the future. I got this workaround from Garrick Aiden Bowie, one of the creators of the BSLib package. I asked on GitHub what's going on with the Quarto dashboard and BSLib interaction, and he was kind enough to explain to me what I have just described. So full credit to Garrick for this one. And again, this issue will likely move away in the future. Quarto dashboards is still relatively young, so it's expected to have these kind of small hiccups. But still, it's impressive what Quarto dashboards can do already today. And as you've seen, we were able to create a nice looking dashboards with just a couple of code chunks all thrown into a Quarto file. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.